Day 257 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine today. And as always, I'll start off with the Russian military losses. So as of the 7th of November, 2022. So in the last 24-hour reporting period, there's been an additional 530 Russian military personnel losses. So currently sitting on 76,460 approximately. Then when we take a look at the Russian hardware losses, so armored combat vehicles, a whopping 19 losses, tanks 6, and artillery 1 loss there. Now we'll move back to the map, where we'll start out today in the Russian Oblast of Belgorod. So another day, another smoking accident really, as there was a big fire explosion reported at an oil terminal in the Graviron district of Belgorod. So that's really close to the border right there. Now, a lot of these Russian motherland explosions are in fact self-inflicted, but based on what I know for this one at this location, I'd have to credit Ukraine with artillery strikes from just over the border, which is really only about 6 kilometers, maybe 3.5, 4 miles. Then we'll move across to the Donbass today, where the heavy fighting continues across down the P66 highway. So that's this yellow highway right here. In fact, it does end up being called the P66. I commonly call it that, but after it hits this junction point, it's actually called that H26 instead. And also right next door to here, the armed forces of Ukraine hit Svatove overnight with HIMARS missiles, inflicting serious damage to enemy brigades there. And moving down just a smidge, so Russian forces continue to launch assaults towards Makivka, so this region here, while Ukrainian forces launch their own counter-assaults. So a deadly back and forth continues here at the moment. This is the same location where just the other day, almost an entire Russian battalion was wiped out. Nearly 600 Russian soldiers. I believe that was the 2nd of November. And then moving a little bit down the map, so you might remember Lumen right here. So Russian forces have been shelling this location early this morning, which reminds me, you might remember when the Russian forces were actually stationed at Lumen, and they were in fact, as a result, shelling Sloviansk and Kramatorsk quite heavily. Now, of course, this was about a couple of months ago, before Ukraine, in fact, liberated this whole region, including Lumen and Yampil. But the good news is these days, for at least these two towns, so Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, is they hardly ever get shelled or hit anymore. They're just too darn far away for Russian artillery shells to reach now. So it's as a result of Russian forces being pushed back, they have to get the next nearest town, basically. And then moving down a little bit further, we're already here, but Russian forces continued with failed attacks on the Ukrainian-held location of Bilorivka, right there, from two directions, whilst Ukrainian forces continued to conduct localized counteroffensives nearby at Spurn, so really quite the front line at Spurn there as well. But no changes on the map there in the last 24 hours. And then we'll go a little bit further down. So a Russian MBTL, so an armored fighting vehicle, tried to outflank Ukrainian troops in Soledar. So here's Soledar, and they tried to outflank from really a little bit further down at really close to where this arrow is, in fact. But Ukrainian troops discovered them and eliminated that MBTL as a result. What I'll do is quickly move down, a bit of a backstory here. If you've been following the channel, you might be aware, but at Pavlivka. So, in follow-up to a big withdrawal from the Russian side here a few days ago, so the Russians that were stationed at the Russian-occupied Red region, just south of Pavlivka, it so happens that pro-Russian military bloggers have now been reporting through their telegram channels about heavy losses of the Russian army during the battles for the village of Pavlivka. And now it's also been further discovered that Russia had actually attempted this disastrous offensive during some really rainy and muddy terrain at the time of that failed offensive, which is poor military strategic form to go on the offensive during the what it's called Raputitsa weather conditions, those really rainy and muddy conditions. And now, because of all that, as a result, next door at Vuhledar, right there, Russian units are refusing to advance and writing letters of complaints to their commanders and governors about their situation. They write, and I quote, "Blood is pouring and pouring." So they're referring to the heavy losses that the brigade took when they tried to advance at the adjacent Pavlivka, I've just mentioned there. And we're talking about more than 300 men from the 155th Brigade reportedly dead, wounded, or missing. So this is the Russian brigade. Oh, and half of their equipment has been gone, also wasted. And I believe this is maybe part 2 of a 3-step process for Russian soldiers. So part 1 would be to accept and heroically go to war. Then part 2 is to get to the front line and realize that they're simply outmatched, thus pleading for commanders and government for assistance for more equipment, for properly working equipment as well, I should say, for air support, for better conditions all around, all those sorts of things. And then when that pleading fails, I theorize the next part may be down the line or sooner than we expect, part 3. So potentially they may ultimately become deserters or perform military mutiny against Russia in a big defiance towards their very own commanders. But fingers crossed, and only time will tell if the Russian soldiers will do this. And now, in terms of loot or captured Russian hardware in this region, so there's always a few things. I'll just quickly mention what I've found. So, like this Russian BMP-2 left behind in Pavlivka as well, specifically by the Russian forces when they were forced to withdraw. Then we'll move across to Zaporizhia today. So, the Russian army used an S-300 missile to shell a village just 12 miles south east of the city of Zaporizhia. Again, taking out yet another patch of grass right there. Now, Russian S-300 air defense surface-to-air missile systems are an ongoing poor choice for land-based targets by the Russian army, but mostly it's just what they have left in their stockpiles, as Russia's more modern high-precision missiles are in shockingly low supply. Then we'll move across to the adjacent oblast of Kherson, the other front line here. Now, I'll start off by saying that in this region, Ukrainian citizens in this Russian-occupied area of Kherson have been reporting that a high ratio of Russian soldiers there are mobilized conscripts, which we can really expect at this point now anyway. They also reported that the Russian conscripts are moving unknown material into basements, but what they reportedly aren't doing, the Russian conscripts, is fortifying the city perimeter. So we're talking about Kherson city here in this case. So again, doesn't really look like an offensive military force. Oh, and speaking of that, very interestingly in this area, Russians have been blowing up their own ammunition dumps around this location, particularly Berislav and a few places just north of the Dnieper River, as evidenced by intercepted calls between the so-called DPR fighters and their relatives back home. So in the intercepted calls, the soldiers didn't understand why the Russian soldiers are doing things like this if they plan to take back Kherson at a later date. And I can only imagine the conversations had back at Ukrainian command and the confusion that lies therein. Because it's one thing for an invading Russian force to retreat and blow up bridges upon retreat, but to blow up your own ammo dumps? I mean, we must be looking at some of the most lowest morale troops in recent known history. And lastly for this region today, Ukrainian forces conducted a pinpoint strike on a Russian base in Nova Kakhovka. So that's just below the dam right there. The losses are quite substantial and rumored to be about 150 plus Russian soldiers staying there at the time of the strike. Things like these are all too common, to be honest. So basically, it's a circular approach here. So Russia deals with many losses on the front lines, so then they bring in more conscripts at the very same locations to fill the gaps, and shortly thereafter, they're taken out by Ukrainian strikes again. And it's almost like the Russian forces have a short-term memory. But maybe they have no memory at all, because any troops that would remember were in fact rather taken out by the strikes in these very same locations. And compound all of that with the fact that the Russian commanders staged at these locations just further back are said to be very poor at communicating strategy to the frontliners. In fact, sometimes they don't communicate at all. In fact, not just sometimes, that's been known to be happening quite a lot in this war. Then we'll move across to some news for today. So Ukraine has confirmed that it has now received new heavy long-range artillery from Italy, including 6 PZH-2000s and 2 M270 MLRS systems. So these are the multiple launch rocket systems. And just note, these M270 systems are very similar to HIMARS systems. They use the same rockets and launchers, although the HIMARS just happens to be a lighter design with very high mobility by contrast. That's what the HI stands for in HIMARS. So shoot and scoot, as they say. Having said that, the M270s are much better armored than the HIMARS equivalents. So in the end, it's really good to see Italy providing Ukraine with all of this extra offensive firepower. So good for them. Then in some other news, Russia has changed its commander for the Russia's central military district of this war. So Colonel Lapin has been replaced with Major General Linkov. Now, when this sort of thing happens, this actually follows a whole series of dismissals, really, of senior Russian military commanders since the beginning of the invasion, and these changes signify that Putin is upset with failures to achieve objectives on the battlefield. But I've got to say, changing commanders isn't going to help the Russian offensive. The issues go far deeper than this, such as because of the usage of poorly equipped brigades and untrained soldiers, just for starters. Many, many more reasons there as well. And then in another mobilization blunder, so in this video we've got mobilized soldiers that got into a fight outside of a market in Omsk. Now this is in the Russian territory there, so obviously not on the front lines. Now, someone should break up this fight with a big morale booster and say something like, hey, the fight's out there, not here. But maybe even then that won't help, because I think Russian morale started to decline permanently after they realized they couldn't take the capital back in March this year. And we're talking really 9 months ago now. And just a bit of a really quick funny today, guys, to round it off with. So Russian forces in this video, now they've been looting a lot of things recently, including toilets and washing machines, oddly enough. And I've gone to many lengths to speak about that. But now it seems they've taken it one step further. A children's toy locomotive. How low can you go, really? But that's all I'll say on that one for today. So that's about it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Ignore all of the trolls in the comments. There is plenty of them. It's just not worth it. And I do hope to see all of you guys there on the next one. Cheers.